This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. The troubles in Venezuela, decades in the making, have reached a breaking point. As widely reported, the country is in crisis. Millions of Venezuelans have left. Millions more are without basic food and medicine. And two men are fighting for power. Today, Where We Live, we learn more about what's happening in Venezuela and how its instability affects Latin America. Should the U.S. play a role in a solution? You can join us. The number 860-275-7266. As always, find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live to get a better idea of what's happening on the ground in Venezuela. Joining up the show by phone is Scott Smith. He's an Associated Press correspondent based in Caracas. Scott, welcome to our show.
Good morning, Lucy. Thanks for having me.
We understand tomorrow is actually a significant date when we look at what's been happening in Venezuela, revolving around humanitarian aid and the opposition leader, Juan Guaido. Tell us what's going on there.
Yeah, well, as you say, tomorrow is an important date. Juan Guaido, who is the sort of self-proclaimed interim president who's risen to challenge President Nicolas Maduro, set tomorrow as a date for bringing in humanitarian aid, primarily from the United States and some other countries, which has been for several days, a week or longer now, stored on the border in Colombia and also in some other bordering countries. President Nicolas Maduro refuses to let this in. He says this is, part of a U.S. coup plot to oust him from power. However, opposition leader Juan Guaido says that they're going to bring it in, and tomorrow is the day they're going to move it in. So it's really sort of forming a showdown between these two men who both claim the presidency of Venezuela.
Can you tell us more about Juan Guaido and a little bit about why he has named himself interim president?
Yeah, Juan Guaido is a deputy in the National Assembly, basically Venezuela's Congress, and he was named the president of the Congress, the National Assembly, in January, just after the new year started. And there's been a long battle, certainly, for control of Venezuela, and basically in January, Juan Guaido rose to prominence and called for massive street protests and asked people to show their support for him. And on January 23rd, which is a historically significant date for Venezuela, he called a mass protest and surrounded by tens of thousands of supporters in a wide avenue in Caracas, declared that he is going to assert his right to the presidency of Venezuela, saying that President Nicolas Maduro illegitimately holds the presidency, which, according to Guaido, gives him the constitutional right to establish a transitional government and call for new elections in Venezuela. So that's how Juan Guaido was really a really unknown figure, although in the Congress, and really has become sort of a rising star in the opposition movement and rallied lots of support by Venezuelans who are eager for change.
You mentioned Venezuelans are eager for change. So in terms of this power struggle that's going on now in Venezuela, we started the show talking about the fact that U.S. and other countries are sending humanitarian aid. Why has it gotten so bad there in the fact that people don't have enough food? And are many Venezuelans blaming President Maduro for that?
Yeah, this is a crisis that's been years in the making. Depends certainly who you ask, but critics of Maduro blame Maduro and his predecessor, Hugo Chavez, a charismatic Venezuelan president who died of cancer about 6-7 years ago, 2013, and basically launched a socialist revolution in Venezuela. Remember, too, that Venezuela is a oil-producing country, and in recent years the price of oil has sort of fallen. Big debts incurred by the Chavez government are now coming to haunt them. And basically it's been sort of a forming, growing standoff with the United States, which really opposes Maduro's socialist policies, and they've applied sanctions against Venezuela, and the economy is collapsing. There's been just a huge move by Chavez and Maduro, who's picked up on those policies to nationalize all of the major industry, and it's just been a collapsing situation. So today, for example, it's really difficult to find basic food and medicine, antibiotics even. Aspirin is difficult to find in pharmacies here, and people are really struggling. And so it's sort of reached a head at this point, and so politically and in terms of the humanitarian crisis, it's really sort of peaking at this moment.
This is Where We Live. With us by phone is Scott Smith, Associated Press Correspondent based in Caracas, Venezuela, as we spend part of our show today trying to understand why Venezuela is in crisis. You can join us, too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. I wanted to ask a little bit more, Scott, in terms of how Venezuelans see the words of President Trump, the fact that these latest sanctions that are impacting, I guess, the main oil company in Venezuela. Do they see the U.S. as being a force that can help them, or are they concerned that the U.S. is only in it for themselves in some way?
Yeah, it's interesting. It depends who you ask. There's a lot of Venezuelans who are sick of the political climate and the crisis that they're living in, having trouble finding basic goods, as I mentioned. And they are eager to have the United States lend a hand and remove Maduro from office. There are people, in fact, you talk to who are not shy in saying that they are eager for the Marines to come in and remove Maduro and his administration. Certainly, anytime there's a large street protest, I go out and I talk to people on the other side of the story. There are certainly supporters of Maduro, people who are diehard Chavistas, as they're called, and following in the footsteps of Hugo Chavez. And they do believe that the United States is an imperialist power, and this is a storyline that Maduro repeats again and again whenever he's on television and talking, that the United States is only interested in coming in and taking advantage of Venezuela's oil in its own backyard here. They point to other coups that the United States has led, military invasions in Latin America. There's certainly a documented long history of American U.S. involvement in Latin American countries and regime change. Maduro also points to recent examples in, the Middle East, Iraq, Libya, and warns that if the United States comes in, there's going to be blood on Trump's hands, and this is going to be the next, Latin America's version of Vietnam.
We talked about the contested election and the fact that Juan Guaido was a leader in the National Assembly. If we could learn a little bit more of what happened after that, from President Maduro actually coming up with his own National Assembly and stacking loyalists to its own Supreme Court.
Yeah, it's interesting. So primarily the only institution of government that is not controlled by President Maduro is the National Assembly. It's dominated by opposition members, and as I said, Juan Guaido is the president of that. But yeah, the elections council in Venezuela is controlled by Maduro loyalists. The Supreme Court is as well, and in fact, 2 years ago, out of frustration that the National Assembly was not approving Maduro's policies, he created a National Constituent Assembly, which is basically, formed of Chavistas, people who are loyal to Maduro, and created really a sort of a second legislative body in the country that historically has, had just the one National Assembly. So he created this Constituent Assembly, which he now uses as his Congress to outmaneuver his opposition folks, and basically passes all the policies that he wants through the Constituent Assembly. So not only do we have sort of two presidents, people claiming presidency at this point, but there's also two Congresses, and you go down the line. There's also an exiled Supreme Court, people that are opposed to Maduro, who are basically living outside of the country, but still claim to be Venezuela's legitimate Supreme Court.
We talked about the U.S. role earlier, again, with sanctions and the rhetoric coming from the U.S. administration. But how much of a role did the U.S. play in elevating Juan Guaido, if at all?
Well, certainly the United States, the Trump administration, and his advisors were among the first when Guaido announced that he's assuming presidential powers. Donald Trump initially, was among the first, if not the first, to say, yes, I recognize Juan Guaido. And they quickly came out and said, we will support Juan Guaido with humanitarian aid. And sure enough, it showed up on the border of Colombia. More is coming in, we understand. And, at this point now, it's not just the United States. Certainly there are, I've sort of lost count at this point, but at least 50 other countries, primarily, conservative countries in Latin America, Colombia, Brazil, among the two leading members, and several European countries that have thrown their support behind Juan Guaido and his bid to oust President Maduro. For his part, he also has supporters. Backers of Maduro and his government are certainly Russia, which is heavily invested in Venezuela and sort of also at odds with the United States, which is an interesting ally of Venezuela. The Chinese also are heavily invested in Venezuela and supporting Maduro. So he's not without his supporters as well.
We're talking about, again, this humanitarian aid that's coming in. Russia has also been sending aid, which Maduro has accepted because they've been longtime allies.
That's right. We learned just this week, in fact, that Russia has sent in several tons of emergency supplies. Maduro all along, has refused to allow in the U.S. Humanitarian aid. Obviously, considers the United States, an enemy and colonial power trying to take over Venezuela. And he also says, we're not going to accept U.S. aid. We're not a country of beggars. And in fact says that Venezuela is going to accept aid from Russia, but is going to pay for it. So we'll see how that plays out.
And Scott, why not the UN or Red Cross? Why are they not involved?
Yeah, I think at this point so far, Maduro has not asked for help. Again, he's very proud. And Venezuela, for the last couple of years, the crisis has gotten worse and people struggle to get by, has created its own system of, help. About every month or 6 weeks, residents here can buy boxes of subsidized food, basic staples, rice, cooking oil, a bit of protein, perhaps canned tuna, things like this. So Maduro says, we don't need help. We're able to provide for our own people, and thank you very much. We don't want your help.
And then lastly, Scott, when we think about, again, this power struggle and what will happen with the opposition leader heading to the border, trying to bring in aid from the U.S. and other countries that have pretty much said they don't see President Maduro as legitimate, what is the role of the military, and are they still loyal to Maduro?
Yeah, the military in Venezuela is really the linchpin to any potential change of leadership. At this point, the military and certainly the chief officers in the military have remained steadfastly behind Maduro. Certainly, the military obviously controls the power. They have the weapons and the troops to suppress any uprising that happens, and they've done that in recent weeks. And that's something that Juan Guaido has really lobbied. When he initially came out, he said, I need the support of Venezuela's people. I need you to show your support. And he says, I also need the military. If this is going to happen, the military needs to come behind. He and the opposition-controlled National Assembly have worked on legislation to offer amnesty to any military members who reject Maduro and support their bid to change the administration. But at this point, we've seen a few sort of isolated cases of defectors, people who are leaving the military. But not a critical mass at this point has started to show that's throwing their weight behind Juan Guaido and turning their back on Maduro. So that's certainly a key player in this scenario that we're all watching very closely.
Scott Smith, again, is a correspondent with the Associated Press, joining us today from Caracas, Venezuela. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Lucy.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up, we'll talk to a University of Hartford professor who has family roots in Venezuela. We'll learn more about how the country ended up in the situation it finds itself in today. And we'll also hear from a Venezuelan native who now lives in New Haven, Connecticut. You can join us too, 860-275-7266, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. You've heard of Hugo Chavez. He was Venezuela's president from 1999 until his death in 2013. How does his time as leader impact the situation Venezuela finds itself in today? Or can its instability be traced further back? You can join our conversation, 860-275-7266. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Coming up, we'll talk with a Connecticut resident who grew up in Venezuela. But for more historical context, joining me now in studio is Dr. Marco Cupolo, Associate Professor and Director of the Hispanic Studies Program at the University of Hartford. Dr. Cupolo, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So we were getting a little bit of finding out what's happening on the ground in recent weeks. But tell us, if we go back in time, when we think about Venezuela again as an oil-rich nation, once very prosperous, when was it at its peak and when things were going well for the country?
Well, Venezuela has a very long history as an oil country. Actually, it is the most old oil country in the hemisphere, probably, compared to the United States, the only one, and Mexico, actually. But Venezuela was a big change in the 2030s of the 20th century, when Venezuela started to be an oil country. And it was a huge change because before that, Venezuela actually was a poor country. So that was the main spring, moving, changing completely the economy and society of Venezuela. Was a very fast change and a very like one, which lasted a lot. And that took Venezuela between the 10 most richest country in the world, probably in the 50s. And it was a very long cycle, and the first sign of weakness, real weakness, became evident at the end of the 70s, and it became very clear in 1983, with, at that time, a shocking devaluation for Venezuela.
What happened then?
At the time, the Bolivar, the Venezuelan currency, was devalued significantly and suddenly, and nobody expected that. That was the consequence of investors and Venezuelan moving their money abroad. And so the country had to, the central bank had to close the exchange for several days. They reopened it with a sort of control on the exchange of the Bolivar. That was the beginning, but wasn't so bad. After that, in 1985-96, was the first fall of oil prices after the boom of the 70s, and that was a very sharp one. After that, in 1999, for the first time, the government of Calandre Perez, who was at the second presidential mandate, tried an IMF, an economic readjustment with the support of the IMF, and the reaction was the famous Caracazo riots against this measure, but mainly against the sudden increase of prices and inflation for the first time at that level in Venezuela. The president, they were able to control the riots, but 3 years later, we have, for the first time, Chavez, who led an attempted coup against the government.
This was in 1992? Mm-hmm.
And that was the first time. He failed. There was a second coup d'etat supported by Chavez, by Jay, And the same, it failed. But at that time, of course, we have a very unstable economic situation, which is going in parallel with a very unstable political situation that make Venezuelan society, economy more shaken, I would say. And that was the beginning of a time of uncertainties with peaks of inflation. Actually, the president of Venezuela was impeached. He went to jail. Another president was elected, was Caldera, another very experienced politician of Venezuela. He already was president in the 70s, the same Calandre Perez.
Tell us more about Hugo Chavez. What was his promise? That obviously you mentioned the currency had been devalued. There was a hyperinflation. So when people heard of Hugo Chavez, what was his? Why were they drawn to him? What were the promises that he made? Just
one thing. At the time, we had a high inflation. We didn't have a hyperinflation.
That's going on now.
Yeah, now it's a really hyperinflation. Mm-hmm. So Chavez started, and in 30 seconds, TV
You have
message.
more. You have more than 30 seconds.
In 30 seconds, he was able to say something on TV, and suddenly, after the coup d'etat in 1982, and he became a leader, practically. He became a person known in Venezuela. And at the beginning, actually, it wasn't very clear that he was a leftist leader. He was more like a nationalistic, Bolivarian, in some aspect, very general speaking, kind of new actor in the political scene of Venezuela. Later, especially after his election in 1998, when he was for the first time candidate for the presidency, he started to move slowly move to some leftist position, especially because around him he had people coming from the old Venezuelan left. But after the 2002 coup against him, really he radicalized that. And a little before that, and especially after, he became more and more radical, leftist, more socialist-oriented, and he looked for the support of Cuba, of course. Then we see the Chavez, the radical socialist, leftist leader in Venezuela and in Latin America, actually.
So what changed under his leadership after 2002? How did the country change?
The country changed with a very... the big change, I would say, that's my opinion, is making of Bolivarian ideas and leftist ideas one thing. This is new in Venezuela. We had an interpretation of Bolivar, and a very crucial one in making the national identity of the country. But we had some leftist interpretation, but usually Bolivar was more seen as a kind of ideology for the conservative right of Venezuelan politics. So this has been a big change for Venezuela, for the interpretation of Bolivar in Venezuela and outside Venezuela. At the same time, it's being more and more closer to Cuba. That has been another big move in the international arena. Since 2002, the presence of Cubans in Venezuela has been more and more important, in some aspect even crucial.
In studio with me is Dr. Marco Cupolo, Associate Professor and Director of the Hispanic Studies Program at the University of Hartford, as we learn a little bit of history of Venezuela, as we're talking about the crisis that the country faces today. Also joining us by phone is Domingo Medina, who actually lives in New Haven, Connecticut. He was born in Caracas. Domingo, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
We were listening to the professor talk about how Chavez came to power, the things that caused unrest but also change in Venezuela. What do you remember from growing up there?
Listen, when Chavez came into power in 1999, even after he did the attempt coup against Carlos Andrés Pérez, there was a lot of excitement because he was he was trying to break basically a bipartisan type of system where you had a lot of need to have a much more stable economy. And this guy came in and promising, reforms, promising to equalize society, to minimize poverty, to review the Constitution. And there was a lot of excitement that people were able to participate and basically review the Constitution and make it much more egalitarian for everybody. And so there was a lot of promises. And mostly he was speaking to a crowd that felt neglected and marginalized for a long, long time. Now, this is the discourse that was bringing in, and there were people buying into it. And of course, he won the elections fairly and square, and they had the support not only of the Venezuelan people, but of the economic systems and even the news and like the professor said, there was no mentioning of any socialism or communism, or he was more very populist type of leader that where everybody was excited to see what's happening. And at the time, he benefited for a huge amount of money that came from the oil industry. So he had all the conditions to make Venezuela a much better country in the beginning. And then the promise didn't happen.
Dr. Cupolo, Domingo mentioned the fact that there's a lot of money coming in. So what did Chavez do with that?
Well, the money came in after 2002, when Chavez started his presidential mandates. The country was still having very low oil prices. Now, after the 2002 coup, Chavez became popular, first of all, because he was able to take advantage of this failed coup. He became stronger politically. People really supported, especially military, the help it came. And after he was extremely liked, he got this very long cycle of very high oil prices, which lasted until 2013 practically. Not only that, but he also gets some very generous credit line from China, especially from China, and from a big support from Russia.
Oh, yeah.
And he started to export oil to China, Russia, India, and was a lot of money. And he invested a lot in social help for poor people. That was a very smart move, but was a very expensive one.
Yeah.
And now the point is keeping that. Probably the big illusion, not only of Chavez, of many Venezuelan politicians, is that this cycle are going to last forever. Yeah. But inevitably there are some cycle of oil prices. Yeah. And it ended at 2030. It was a very good shot. But I would say even with this price, Venezuela could be fine, more or less. Yeah. But with the huge amount of debt accumulated through that investment, now it's really a very dire straight situation. There are no exits because there is no money.
Domingo, we've seen the number reported from the UN that more than 3 million Venezuelans have left the country. You're one of them. Why did you leave?
Listen, I basically am part of a not so recent migration. I used to work for a non-for-profit in Venezuela in conservation. I used to work with indigenous people and peasants in rainforest environment, and I started working basically on indigenous land rights. This was a promise by Chavez in the new constitution in 1999, where indigenous people's rights were going to be recognized, and actually were recognized on paper. So I was out there, helping translate mental maps to, geographical maps that they could be presented as a proposal for the government to be recognized. And to today, there hasn't been any meter square of land recognized for indigenous people at all. So that's how I started, and I was working, and what the conditions of work basically started to degrade because the government started to intervene in the type of funding that we could receive. And then they were infiltrating a lot of the communities there in terms of, politicizing them, dividing them, providing them resources, and sometimes coercing them to the point that it was very difficult to work with communities. And for me, it became too costly to work there. And then I ended up here in New Haven with my wife that works here. So that was the condition for me on a personal basis, just on one case. What I want to say is that, when you have a massive amount of people moving out of a country, nobody really wants to migrate. The condition has to be very difficult for people to make a decision to leave their own country, knowing that outside you don't know what you're going to find. If you're going to be well received, you're going to find a job, if you're going to have where to stay. So for me, it's a major indicator that of desperation, that people basically are looking to survive. And that's what we're receiving right now. Here in Connecticut, with I really didn't have very, very few Venezuelans that I knew. Now I basically find many of them around in the town, and we're trying to help each other and to position ourselves. But I can't imagine the amount of people that are moving to Colombia, that are moving to Brazil, to Peru, to Ecuador by foot, because, of course, they don't have the means to travel elsewhere, and the only means is their legs, the two legs and the feet. And they're creating a major pressure in these other countries to be able to host them and to attend them and to provide them with aid. So it's very, very critical what's happening right now.
Dr. Cupolo, we talked about Chavez a little bit. I'm curious about the ascent of Nicolas Maduro. If you could fill in that part of the story for us, and in the beginning, how he was viewed, and since that time, what has happened?
Well, Chavez was essentially a military man. And he had that kind of style in making politics, etc. Maduro is different. He comes from a very long experience in he now is a very long. He has been a Chavista, a supporter of Chavez for a long time. But before that, he was a bus driver of the company of transportation of Caracas subway. And he has a long experience like a union leader. And you can see that. He's very good in negotiation with somebody, and like a union leader. But he doesn't have absolutely the charismatic power of Chavez. And that has been it's been very clear during the election. People, even Chavistas, they say, okay, he's not Chavez, but he's the one Chavez told us to vote for. So Maduro became the president of Venezuela, but he doesn't have the popularity of Chavez, never had it. And even worse is that he was not popular in a time of crisis, because he practically inherited this crisis from the time of Chavez. And he has been really, I honestly, bad at the job. This crisis was coming. Now, practically but even Chavez before him are blaming some kind of a war against Venezuela, and then especially against their revolution. But there are a lot of mistakes in the economic policy of this administration, the Chavez one, and the Maduro one. And I would like, probably this is a surprise, telling this for many, but this has practically almost the same mistakes that previous government of Venezuela made. But when the country had a much healthier economy, the problem is now they're doing the same mistake in a very terrible situation, which is keeping some control on price, control of foreign exchange, control on right of interest. In this way, there are no exits for the socialists or capital, whatever they want to say. There are no way of going, having some solution for the current situation of Venezuela.
This is Where We Live. In studio with me, Dr. Marco Cupolo, Associate Professor and Director of the Hispanic Studies Program at the University of Hartford. And on the phone, Domingo Medina, a New Haven resident who was born in Caracas, as we focus in on why Venezuela is in crisis today. Domingo, I did want to ask you, what do you think about what's happening on the ground today, this power struggle between these two men? Do you see a path forward for your country?
Listen, there's a standoff. There's a major standoff. The pressure is up. There's going to be today a big event, a concert on the border of Colombia and Venezuela on the Colombian side, to basically, for human aid. There's a lot of containers and food and aid that has come from different countries waiting to be able to get into the country through the border. Also in the south in Brazil. Also, there's a lot of aid. Maduro don't want the aid to come in. They feel somehow that it's not needed, that this is just a limosna, basically petty money, and that it's not needed. And on the other side, there's a recognition by everybody that there's a lot of desnutrition. There's a lot of need for basic treatment for medicines, for diabetes, for asthma, for salmonella, malaria, tuberculosis. There's 300,000 people that are in a critical condition that if they are not attended, they are in the risk of dying. So Guaido has basically has said that the humanitarian aid is going to come in on the 23rd. That means tomorrow. There's a bridge that crosses the border between Colombia and Venezuela, where the Venezuelan government has put containers to block the entrance. So here is always going to be dependent whether the militaries, the ones that are going to be facing the crowd, are going to allow for the humanitarian aid to come in or not. Maduro won't be there up front. Diosdado Cabello won't be there. They're going to be sending these troops in front to see what they're going to do. So, we are all concerned because how the militaries right now are going to respond is whether they try to follow the Constitution or they want to maintain this regime that is a totalitarian regime. So there's a lot of concern that, that things are not going to go smooth. What's true is that people don't want bloodshed. People don't want conflict. For 20 years, people have demonstrated that they want to make changes democratically in a fair basis under a constitution that is our social contract for us. And we want to avoid any type of conflict. People are out there willing to aid, willing to volunteer, to even supply this aid by foot, even to walk the bridge and find it wherever it's needed and bring it home. So it's a power play right now, and the Guaido is backed up by a lot of national and international organizations, and what Maduro has is the militaries, and he has been very clever in trying to keep them isolated, in their barracks without having information at all what's happening. As you know, there's no alternative media right now in Venezuela. The only thing you can find information is through YouTube or WhatsApp or these networks that people have done with. But, if you are in a barrack and a military, you don't get to listen to what's happening out there. You only listen to the voice of your commander-in-chief. So we are very much concerned about that.
And Domingo, when we heard from the reporter earlier talking about suspicions about U.S. involvement, looking at history and how U.S. was involved in different interventions and coups, some critics would say that the U.S. is causing some of the struggles on the ground and this power struggle. What would you say to them?
Wow. I hear this everywhere, and even there's going to be some demonstration here in this Sunday. Listen, I grew up learning and knowing about the foreign relationship of the U.S. with many, many countries. And we know about the atrocities. We know about how a dictatorship has been handled over the years. What I want to make sure is that, we are in a world order that we can't control of. You have powers out there, there are interests out there, and it comes from the U.S., comes from China, comes from Russia, comes from many countries. And right now, if we only tend to look at this in a dichotomous way of left and right, capitalist or socialist, we are missing the whole point. The Venezuelans have agency. The Venezuelan people put Chavez there. The Venezuelan people put Maduro there, and now they don't want them there, and they want them out. And it took a lot of lobbying inside of the country and outside of the country to make, to be able to shed light on what was happening in the country, to find the support. And the support that had to come from individual governments, because not even the United Nations as an organization or the Organization of American States were eager to jump into recognizing that what we were dealing with was a dictatorship. So it's the Venezuelan people that want to change. Negate that and say that this is just the intervention of the United States is saying that 30 million people don't know what they're doing and they're manipulated. We are not stupid. We are highly educated people. We have one of the highest social capital percentage of people in the country, in the whole Latin America. The oil allows us to go and study not only in Venezuela but outside. So we are highly trained people that recognize when your social contract, your constitution is being violated. And then when you want to have stable institution and stable economy to be able to grow in a powerful way and be able to participate in your own future. When you can't have those opportunities, you want to change the model. And when the constitution, when the law, when the institutions are not there to protect you, what are you left with? You are left with trying to make change in a democratic way, but you need help from outside.
Domingo, we're short on time. I wanted to go back to our in-studio guest, Dr. Marco Cupolo, again, Associate Professor and Director of the Hispanic Studies Program at the University of Hartford. Dr. Cupolo, we'd mentioned so many have left Venezuela. In our maybe in the last couple of minutes we have for this segment, what do you see as a path forward again for this country in terms of trying to turn around? Is it too late?
It's not too late, I believe. Certainly, it's going to take time to recover because really the situation has been very deteriorated. But I agree with Domingo in the sense that we don't have to oversimplify the Venezuelan situation. It looks like the oversimplify would be like a kind of in technical term, would be a kind of game on brinkmanship, on the edge between two sides. No, on one side Maduro, on the other side Guaido, on one side Venezuela, on the other side United States. It looks like a kind of context where you see that something like the Cold War. We no longer have a Cold War today, and Venezuela has not to be taken through or seen through this kind of perception. We have many actors now playing around Venezuela, and unfortunately, who is going to pay if something goes wrong is Venezuelan people, but there are Cubans, there are Chinese governments, Russian governments, United States, Europe. There are many immigrants from Europe in Venezuela living there, and it's something a little more complicated than just getting out from an economic, very deteriorated situation. And Venezuela is true. I mean, Venezuela is a country with a lot of oil. Could be a huge advantage, as it was in the past, but could be also a huge problem because it means a dispute on the crucial energy resource of this century.
We'll have to leave it there, but we thank you for coming in. Dr. Marco Cupolo, Associate Professor and Director of the Hispanic Studies Program at the University of Hartford. Again, as this story continues to play out in the headlines, it's good to have the context, so we appreciate your time.
Thank you for inviting me.
Also, Domingo Medina, thank you for calling in today.
Thank you very much.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up, we're going to learn more about a new London-based group, that highlights the art and culture of Central and South American countries and works specifically with school children. This is Where We Live. This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We just heard about one country on a very diverse continent. In Connecticut, there's a nonprofit based in New London that celebrates Central and South American art and culture and serves as a bridge between artists and the Latino community, especially its children. For more, joining me in studio now is Lee Toth, board member of Expresiones, this nonprofit based in New London, Connecticut. Lee, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Lucy.
So tell us about the nonprofit and why was it formed?
Well, it was founded by two South American immigrants, Guido Gargachea and Jose Gargachea Ulloa, and we became a nonprofit in 2009. And the motivation is to bridge multicultural, or to build multicultural bridges through artistic and educational endeavors. And we have a focus on children and very dedicated to teaching children. Initially, we started off with the Drop-In Learning Center in New London. They came in, and as we've evolved, we've become involved with the New London Public Schools. What is unique about our program is we have artists come from South America and Central America, and these are professional bilingual artists, and they come now for a period of 2 to 3 months, and there's an apartment above the gallery. They live there. They become involved in the community, and part of what they do is they work on their art for the time that they're there and have a solo exhibit at the end of their residency. But as part of their residency, they have a commitment to the community and to community service. And we have collaborated with the New London Public Schools in that they will go in and work, say, maybe with a teacher or an art teacher. They will develop a project, and at the end of the time, they get to recently the artists have had the children's work displayed along with theirs in the gallery, which is actually really cool. The kids love it.
So you have artists coming from Honduras and other places working with children in the community. And so what has been some of the outcomes? As far as like the outcomes, I think one of the things I want to be clear about is like these artists don't really teach art. They use art for the children to learn how to express themselves, how to explore creativity, and how to problem solve. And I want to see if I can quickly give an example of a couple of these. One of the Honduran artists last fall that was here taught the children about Mayans. So they're learning history and something. Obviously, they think that's cool. And what he did was show them the different types of Mayan symbols for like their birth months. So the children created the symbols. They embellished them to make them their own. They colored them, and then they were displayed. So they're learning all these different things. And one of the other artists that we had from Argentina, also last fall, had children paint faces, but he just used 3 primary colors. And what he did was, what the kids learned was that they could make different colors with the 3 primary colors, so that it's not just about creating a piece of art, but it's also learning and exploring with that. Now, New London has a diverse community, and so this is a nonprofit that's funded primarily through community donations. How do you plan on expanding this work? We've got about a minute.
Okay. Well, we're trying. We're working really hard to get sustainable grants. We're grants, donations, and volunteers, and that is our motivation: is to try and expand through getting ourselves out there so people understand what we're doing, and because it is a very unique program, and we celebrate the diversity, we embrace it, and I think it's a great cultural exchange.
Well, we'll definitely send our listeners to our website, wnpr.org/wherewelive, to learn more about Expresiones. You do have a current artist in residence from Peru, so they can learn more about that.
Yes.
But we do appreciate you coming in to tell us a little bit about the nonprofit and and the work you're doing in the southeast corner. Thank you so much, Lito.
Thank you very much, Lucy.
Today's show produced by Lydia Brown. Thanks to our technical director, producer, and Kyone Wolf and Carmen Baskoff on the phones. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. As always, thanks for listening.